This summer, I'm going to be going on sabbatical for 3 months. By June 1st, I will have been at Lawrence Park for 5 years, if you can believe it. Amazing. And what a 5 years it's been. They don't tell you about pandemics when you sign up for seminary. So, fortunately, a lovely tradition, ministers get a little bit of time off so they can refresh and learn some new things. And I'm going to do something that I've been hoping to do for many years now. And I'm going to go to Rome for about 3 weeks in July, and I'm going to completely geek out over early Christian art. That's something I've been fascinated with for a long time. And the reason I care about Christian art is, A, I'm a visual kind of guy, obviously, background in television, but also because Christianity has gone through various phases. And when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, it changed. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later in this sermon. But I'm interested in what it was like before the Roman Empire got involved, when it was really, really close to the people who knew Jesus and had walked with him and were spreading his ideas over the first few generations. And so I'm going to go to Rome, where the very first artists put up images of what they thought Jesus looked like and what this faith was about. And the very first image we have of Jesus is as the Good Shepherd. And here's an image of it. If maybe we could just get rid of the subtitles for a second so people could see it all. So it's faded. This appeared around the year 200. So a very, very long time ago. Okay, you can put the subtitles back on. Thanks, guys. And we see Jesus as a shepherd with a lamb over his shoulders and a couple of sheep on either side of him. And this was, for the first 100 years, like from the year 200 to 300, this was the most popular image of Jesus, bar none. There's about 100 of these. And here's another one, just to give you an idea of some of the variety of it. No one thought that this is what Jesus looked like. He doesn't look like a rabbi, he doesn't have long hair, doesn't have a beard, any of that. No. They were representing him symbolically as a good shepherd. And this is the very first image they have of him. They decide to do symbolically. So why is that? This is something that scholars have discussed. Why would Jesus appear as a shepherd first? Well, one reason could be for political reasons. Around the year 200, Christianity is an illegal religion. You can get arrested and even killed for being a Christian. So they couldn't just put his face up everywhere, so they decided to speak in a kind of code. So they chose an image which he had used for himself, saying, "I am the good shepherd." And fortunately, the Romans, in their religion, they also had images of shepherds that looked very much like this, which they would put up. So if a Roman official was walking by and saw this image, they wouldn't immediately guess that it was a Christian image. So smart. Christians got it, but the Romans didn't. Good. The other reason, though, that this image was so important had to do with where it appeared. And we can take the image down now, guys. And where it appeared was in tombs, in what are called catacombs. If you go to Rome, back then, the main roads which radiated out from the city, underneath there were underground tombs called catacombs. And this is where Christians buried their dead. And on the walls, they painted images which were important to them, of people praying like this, of vines, and of the Good Shepherd. And by putting Jesus on the wall as the Good Shepherd in a tomb where the deceased were lying, they were saying, Jesus is the shepherd who leads our souls into good pastures. Those sheep weren't sheep. They were Christian souls who were making the transition from this life to the next life. And they put those images up on the tomb walls as a way of saying, Jesus, please protect my loved one who has died and bring them into a safe afterlife. And the reason this was so important was because the Christians had introduced a new idea about what happens to you when you die. If you asked a Roman or a Greek what happens to you when you die, They would probably say, well, most people will go down to Hades, where they will meet with the ferryman, Charon, get into the boat, cross the river Styx, and then be welcomed into the underworld, where they will spend eternity not really doing anything. It's just a shadowy world. It's boring. Eternity was boring for most people. If you were someone important, like an emperor or like a general who had won some important battles for the empire, then you might be deified and you would have a better afterlife. You would be welcome into the Elysium fields or the Imperium, where you could enjoy the fruits of basically the good life. You'd have a good afterlife. But commoners didn't get that. They didn't deserve a good afterlife because they were nobodies. So if you were an enslaved person, you weren't going anywhere good. You were just going to be a shade, just a shadowy existence for the rest of time. Everyone would forget you. Even eternity would basically forget you. The Christians come along and say, no, 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 no. If you follow Jesus, if you follow this new ethical standard, and you believe in Jesus, you will get what only emperors and generals get among the Romans. You will get a chance to be in heaven with God. And at that time, they imagined heaven to be a garden, like a paradise. So it'd be very much like getting back to Eden. But this was offered to everybody, not just the important elite. Anybody, an enslaved person, could get into heaven. That was completely revolutionary. That idea laid the foundation for much, much later, for like the Enlightenment and human rights. This idea that anybody could be welcomed into heaven was just mind-blowing. And of course, the Romans and Greeks thought it was ridiculous. So to have a good shepherd as the image, a shepherd who was guiding anybody who followed Jesus into the afterlife, was wonderful. Now, of course, as we know, in Christianity, there isn't just heaven. There's also that other place, right? Hell. And Jesus talked about hell a little bit, not much. And it was a fiery lake where Satan and his rebellious angels would go. And so people talked in the early days about, well, what is heaven? We understand heaven, but what's hell about? Because no one wants to go to hell, obviously. So what's it about? Around the same time, like pretty much exactly the same time, as the first images of the Good Shepherd start showing up on walls in Christian tombs, there was a theologian in the city of Alexandria, Egypt, called Origen. His name it looks like Origen, except it's got an E on the end instead of an I. Origen argued, he was considered the first Christian theologian. He was the first one to try and figure out what all this meant and to integrate the New Testament and the Old Testament together. People said that he'd memorized all of the Hebrew Scriptures. And for centuries, people thought of him as an incredible mind. But he had a problem with hell. He recognized that it existed, but he didn't like the idea of people going there. And he wasn't alone. Other Christian theologians of the time said, that's for the demons. It's not for us. And what Origen argued was that anybody who feels distant from God, who deliberately turns their back on God's way by being deeply immoral, by, say, being a serial killer or a rapist or someone who just does evil things all the time, that person has distanced themselves from God, and that person's already in hell, even in this life. And so when they die, nothing changes. They remain in that place, that mindset, which is so distant from God. If you want an image of this, it would be like, imagine a warm fire on a cold night. The people who are closest to God are huddled around that fire, warmed by the warmth of the fire as well as illuminated by its light. But those who choose to be far from God are far, far away in the cold. And you can hear this in Jesus' words in some of his parables, where he says, those who chose not to stay at the wedding went outside where there was weeping and gnashing of teeth. But it's not because God makes them cry. It's because the further you get away from God, the more pain you experience. Because people who don't trust each other, who turn on each other, are living a kind of hell in this life, and they can expect more of the same when they die. Origen felt that God didn't want it this way. God wanted people to draw close to God because that's where safety is. That's where the love is. So Origen wrote, same time as these Good Shepherd images are being put up, he wrote that God's goal is to get everybody close to him, including the devil himself. If there's anybody in hell, God wants them to come to their senses and come up to heaven, and God will wait until even the devil himself comes to his senses and leaves the fiery lake, stops being so selfish and bitter and angry and hateful, and comes to God in love. This idea of hell as being basically empty did not take off in Christianity, as we know, right? When the Roman Empire adopted Christianity as its official religion, the Roman Empire was in the business of running an empire. It was a law and order kind of empire. They believed in rules and things which soldiers did. And you better behave or else we'll invade your town. You better behave or we'll crucify you. You better behave or else, once Christianity got involved, you're going to end up in hell where you will suffer for eternity. That was the new twist. It wasn't a place where you were distant from God that you'd chosen to be in, but rather a place you would be sent and just be left to burn and suffer. And we know that that's where the Roman Catholic Church went with the idea of hell. But it's not where it started. It's not where it started. And this whole idea of hell being this complicated place where people went, that was something invented by the church. About 1,000 years after those Good Shepherd images appeared on those walls, an Italian poet, Dante, wrote his great poem, The Inferno. And in the Inferno, it has this complicated system of 9 circles of hell that go from gluttony, there's the image, from gluttony up at the top, down at the bottom to treachery. Judas is in the last circle of hell with Satan. That whole thing doesn't exist in the Bible. Wasn't Jesus' idea. It's made up. But the Catholic Church loved it. That was great because it kept people in line. You know, I try to be nice with the kids and encourage them in a positive way during my children's time, but we all know, many of us who are older, that there was a time when you could be threatened with eternal consequences as a child if you didn't do the right thing. Now, it is entirely possible, if you could do the math, and only God could do this math, that a whole bunch of murders and rapes and terrible things have been prevented by people being worried about suffering forever. That's probably true. But fear is no way to have a spiritual life. If you base your religion on fear, then you get people who are inherently worried just about themselves, because that's the way fear works. Fear is rarely for a group, it's usually just for yourself. I'm worried about what's going to happen to me. And it makes it very hard to feel in solidarity with other people when you're afraid, because you're just worrying about yourself. And it encourages judgment. Well, I'm not going to hell, but they should. Right? That sort of thinking is encouraged by that idea of religion as being based on fear. The other way, which I think is Jesus' way, is when we are encouraged to see spirituality as something which we experience when we are calm. And this is why we encourage people to pray and to meditate, to open up a space so that when you're praying or meditating, you can hear that still small voice that says, I love you. Why don't you try acting this way for a while? Something that doesn't sound like your idea at all, may be completely the opposite of what you've been doing, but it's a gentle nudge. It's rarely, you've got to do this. If only life were that simple. If God could just tell us what to do, yelling at us, we'd all know what to do. That's not the way it works. Instead, we have to calm down enough so we can hear that still, quiet voice. So, fear or calm? Fear or love? Because that still quiet voice is a loving one. And that takes us back to the Good Shepherd. Those early Christians, before the Roman Empire took over the faith, chose this image to be the very first one they showed of Jesus. The Good Shepherd is loved by his sheep. Sheep count on the shepherd to keep them safe, to keep them away from the wolves, to lead them to good water and good pastures. Lambs like being with shepherds. They count on them for safety and security. But Jesus warns us that not all shepherds are good. Some shepherds, the hired hands, are just in it for themselves. And when they get involved, they'll abandon the sheep at the first opportunity. And I think we're living through a period of history where we're seeing a lot of hired hands in our political circles. There's a lot of leaders out there who seem to be very much in it for themselves and not so concerned about what happens to their flock. But in our modern era, there seems to be one twist on this. Jesus says that at the first sign of trouble, the hired hand will run and leave the sheep to be eaten by wolves. In our era, it appears that the hired hands have figured out that it's better to stay in office so they won't get caught for what they have done. So they're not going to run, but they're going to stay too long. And this seems to be happening all over the world and very close to our country as well. And some of those hired hands even have the temerity to claim that religion is on their side. Putin has done this, and just a few weeks ago, the 45th president of the United States, the Republican nominee for the current election, held up a Bible and said that everybody should buy this Bible and this Bible should be in every household. Reminding us all of that time when he was in power where he held up a Bible upside down and backwards. The hired hands are in it for themselves. They are not good shepherds. The good shepherds care about what happens to their sheep. That is their primary responsibility. That is their primary concern. And so when Christians chose to put up an image of Jesus for the first time, they didn't show him walking on water. They didn't show him multiplying loaves. They showed him as a good shepherd because they believed that Jesus had presented a way of life for them that would save them in this life from their own predilections towards sin and bad behavior, and that Jesus would be with them and guide them in safety even when they died into the next life. And we are still all following that good shepherd, even if his message is often drowned out by the hired hands. Let us remember that we are the lambs that follow that good shepherd, and that this is indeed a blessing. Amen.